Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Shilpa Jindia. I'm a journalist and a lawyer and a member of the National Writers Union. I've reported on the crackdown on Palestinian activism and speech for the Baffler. And we're gathered here today marking 600 days of genocide in Gaza, the first to be live streamed to the world, which has raised very troubling and urgent questions about the role of technology and tech companies in Israel's occupation of Palestine, from digital repression, censorship, and disinformation campaigns to the development of AI-driven weaponry being tested out in Gaza. So we've assembled an excellent panel of experts here today on technology and human rights to discuss the complicity of tech companies in particular in the ongoing genocide, to analyze their impacts, and to outline some recommendations about how we can continue to organize and challenge this regime. So with us today is Tamara Kharoub, the Deputy Executive Director of the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., Nadim Nashif, the co-founder and executive director of Hamle, the Arab Center for the Advancement of Social Media, Paul Bigger, the CEO of Tech for Palestine, and Zelda Montes, an organizer with No Tech for Apartheid and a former Google software engineer. So the format today, we'll have some short opening remarks from our panelists, and then a moderated Q&A before opening it up to audience questions. In terms of some quick logistics, the chat here is disabled. So for audience members on Zoom, you can send in questions using the Q&A feature. And for those who are watching on live stream, you can email questions to events@arabcenterdc.org. And those questions will then be channeled to me. So to kick things off, we'll start with Tamara.
Thank you, Shilpa. And on behalf of Arab Center Washington, D.C., I would like to welcome everyone as well joining us today, and thank the National Writers Union for working with us on putting together this webinar. As the first speaker, I will try in my opening remarks to briefly outline three main industries where media and technology companies can be complicit in Israeli crimes. And those three industries are the information industry, surveillance, and autonomous weapons. First, looking at the information ecosystem, which includes not only the media industry, but also social media platforms. Looking at the media, as many of you know, since October 7th, the legacy mainstream media has exhibited extreme bias in their reporting, often repeating Israeli official and military claims as facts without scrutiny or investigation, and propagating anti-Palestinian racism and dehumanization. But these patterns and policies are not new. They've been well documented for decades, long before October 7th. They are a product of a deliberate erasure of Palestinian narratives that has been taking place, especially in the West, whether in the media and political discourse or in academic and cultural settings. And this serves to manufacture consent for ethnic cleansing and genocide through the dehumanization of Palestinians and the whitewashing and justification of Israeli crimes. And in this case, some media organizations' failure to fulfill their ethical and journalistic duties has rendered them complicit in the genocide. And we've been seeing these attempts at silencing Palestinian and pro-Palestinian speech translate to the social media space. There's ample evidence for the censorship of Palestinian content, taking down posts and accounts, shadow banning, and even compliance with Israeli government requests to remove content, especially by Meta, which is the parent company of Facebook and Instagram. Other issues with social media include their content moderation policies and algorithms that perpetuate disinformation, propaganda operations, and incitement. And we can talk about that in more detail if there's interest. But I want to get to the second point here. The second industry that is complicit is the surveillance industry. And Israel has been using sophisticated mass surveillance and biometric monitoring technologies that also employ AI and predictive algorithms to monitor and subjugate Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And it's been going on for years. For example, the facial recognition system, Red Wolf, is used in Hebron and East Jerusalem, where CCTV cameras track and monitor Palestinians exclusively and automate restrictions on their freedom of movement, even to the point of barring them from entering their own homes. These surveillance tools further entrench Israel's system of segregation, coercion, and apartheid. Red Wolf is also linked to the Wolfpack database, which stores personal information on Palestinians, and the Blue Wolf app, which Israeli soldiers use on their phones and tablets to access this information. Needless to say, this is all happening without the knowledge or consent of the Palestinians being surveilled. Some Israeli companies provide these surveillance technologies to the Israeli military, but also there are other suppliers, including the Chinese company Activism and the Dutch company TKH Security. And there are other big tech companies involved, including Microsoft, which provides the infrastructures for the Israeli military operations, and others like Cisco, HP, and so on, that provide hardware, software, and communication systems. On the surveillance side, there's also the targeted surveillance and spyware, which are installed on Palestinians and others' phones without their knowledge and consent. And there are hundreds of companies, and also we can talk about those if there's an opportunity. But the third and last industry that I want to have the chance to talk about here is the area of autonomous weapons and the growing use of artificial intelligence tools in the genocide in Gaza, thus enabling the automation of warfare and human rights abuses. And when it comes to AI-assisted warfare, several methods are being used by Israel. For example, location monitoring tools, monitoring the movement of the civilians in Gaza, for example, and using this information to inform military decisions and actions. AI systems that generate military targets, such as Lavender and Hasbara, which assign the residents of Gaza digital scores for their likelihood of being a member of a militant group. And some of them even rely on just the sheer membership in a WhatsApp group to make these decisions. Other programs like Gospel, Where's Daddy, and a few others have come to light, and we can talk about them as well. Looking at the tech companies involved, Google and Amazon through Project Nimbus and Microsoft's Azure platform are providing the cloud computing and storage and AI services to the Israeli military and are enabling these abuses. Other companies that supply drones include the Chinese company DJI, whose drones Israel has used to bomb hospitals and shelters in Gaza. Just as a last point, and I will stop there, these AI tools are problematic in many ways. Perhaps most importantly is the issue of digital dehumanization, where people are reduced to data points and innocent civilians are subject to becoming military targets based on inaccurate assumptions, biased information, and unreliable estimations. And this presents a violation of international law. Specifically the requirements on the distinction between civilian and military targets. The other issue could be the lack of accountability, where machines are responsible for making the decisions and assigning targets. And I will stop here and happy to answer any questions and or elaborate on any of these points. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. That was a really helpful, if not disturbing, outline of kind of the scale of the problem that we're seeing, and also important to underline that it's not just American and Israeli tech companies that are part of this complicit regime. And so now for some more discussion about censorship of Palestinian voices and a bit more focus on content moderation, we'll go to Nadim.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this and inviting me to speak in this important webinar. So I wanted to speak about content moderation and also to go a little bit back and to maybe provide some context to this content moderation policies and how in the last decade things evolved. Because when we established Hamle in 2013, it was under the impression of the Arabic Spring, where people in different Arab countries were using social media as part of, democratization of organizing people. The masses were using, in Egypt, Twitter at that time, to go to demonstrations, to organize, to do explainers on YouTube, etc. So that there was this kind of optimism that, technology and social media is something good, is bringing good things to the world. And many people were looking at Tunisia, Egypt, and other places, and getting those as something. And we have been meeting with different activists in Amman at that time in 2014 and learning from each other how to do this digital activism and the tools that are out there. But then for us Palestinians, 2014, 2015, the Israeli pressure started more and more on social media companies, specifically on Facebook. At that time, Gilad Erdan and Ayelet Shaked were the ministries of Interior Security and the Minister of Justice, were accusing Facebook of the different clashes that were happening in Jerusalem and other places, that Facebook is a place for incitement, and they started pushing the company basically to adopt their own definition of what's incitement, what should be there, what should not be there. And the company complied. The company very quickly adopted their policies and started censoring Palestinian narratives, censoring Palestinian stories, deplatforming Palestinians, closing accounts, and all of the process that we are seeing now. It started basically then. The relationship, obviously, I mean, not much, there's no need to explain much about this long-standing relationship, that it has economical aspect of it, as a, Israel as a market of ads. It has the technical, or let's say the technological part of it, of this relationship. Those companies are buying many Israeli startups. Many of the ones who are running the companies, the Israeli companies, are later on are also seniors employees by the companies, including Facebook, Meta, and others. And the third level is the political level, the coordination that's happening in the political level. Those companies are US-centric companies that are complying with the US policies. They are looking at Israel as an ally, as somebody in their own part of their own political camp. And even if there's no specific laws in the US that are telling them to discriminate Palestinians or Arabs, this is what's happening in the end. In the end of the day, and there have been lots of research across the years about how Facebook at that time is looking on Arabic content, not Palestinian, but generally content and people who are coming from the MENA region, from Arabic background and Islamic and Muslim background. One of the interesting things that a couple of years ago, when the dangerous organizations and individuals list was leaked by the Intercept, we studied the 4,000 and something names of people who are not allowed to be at Meta products. And the vast majority of them were people who are coming from the MENA region or Southeast Asia, from Arabic background or Muslim background. At that time, we looked how many Israelis who were not allowed. We found only 2 names, while we found 55 Palestinian names. So you can see that looking at the region, looking at the content of the region, not having any kind of Israeli extreme groups, violent settler groups, hardly having any white supremacist groups or white extreme groups, and looking at the world from one perspective. So for us Palestinians, suppressing our voices and our narratives it comes with 2 layers, not just one layer of discrimination against Palestinians, but it comes first of all from looking at the region at a whole in a very Islamophobic, anti-Arab approach, racist approach, and then adding another layer as a Palestinian. And you can imagine that what's happening with the result. So those policies continued until May 21, In May 21, in the Sheikh Jarrah uprising, as we all remember, there have been a huge criticism to Meta and its platforms, how they dealt with the Palestinian content, the silencing, the shutting down the life of live streaming that was happening from Sheikh Jarrah. This criticism led to basically an audit that was done by an external company that did the due diligence, and they compared. And part of their finding was clearly to say that there is a bias. I mean, obviously, we knew that there is a bias and there is discrimination that's happening, but it was also an important point, important moment where there's an external company who's doing this audit and comparing the content moderation between Arabic language and Hebrew language, and finding that the Hebrew language basically the Hebrew language, there is no content moderation that's happening. So as we all know, there are classifiers, and the content moderation is mostly automated, while there's over moderation that's happening, as I explained previously, on Arabic content and specifically Palestinian. When it comes to Israeli Hebrew language content, there's hardly any. And only because of campaigns that Hamli and other partners have been running after this due diligence report went out later at late 23, there was a deployed of a Hebrew classifier that still not fully functional and not in the level that we wanted in a way. And we are seeing genocidal rhetoric. We have been seeing this from the beginning of the war, and unfortunately we are seeing this even by now. I'll stop here and maybe we'll continue later with the rest of the points. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadeem. And very important to continue underlying, as both you and Tamara did, that none of this is new. It's continuing to accelerate and develop, but these policies and practices are deeply rooted. And so for more context in that respect, we're going to turn to Paul now, who's going to tell us more about sort of what he calls both big tech and little tech complicity in this.
Thanks so much, Shilpa. So to explain, sort of as almost a follow-on from what Nadeem was saying, why is tech like this, right? Why does tech so quick to jump on Israeli policies or to take on things that are anti-Palestinians? And so to do that, you sort of have to understand the nature of the tech industry and into what I call big tech and little tech. So big tech is the companies that we all kind of think of: Google, Meta, all these giant companies with tens or hundreds of thousands of employees, and these folks very quickly after October 7th, and historically as well, but I'm gonna focus on after October 7th. These folks very quickly took on a lot of internal suppression of Palestinian content. So we see that not only is there external suppression and algorithmic suppression on social media networks, but that sort of comes out of an internal culture which is deeply biased against Palestinians, against Arabs, against Muslim folks. And one of the ways that this manifested, we talked to dozens of people who are employees at this company, at all these companies, and they had a lot of similarities. And the first of them was weaponizing of anti-Semitism. So we've seen this across the everywhere, media, political landscape, everywhere. But we would see this in tech companies as well. So people who would speak up for Palestine, even if they're saying something like, "My family got killed today," would be, or family members of mine got killed in Gaza today, would be one example of posts that got taken down internally and things that they weren't allowed to say internally because these big tech companies internally had groups of pro-Israel employees who were working together to weaponize that anti-Semitism. So they would make complaints to HR departments who are not really trained on what is the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and often are based in the United States, where there's even much less knowledge about that, would react, and they would take down the content, and often they would reprimand the individuals who made that content, while letting by content that, say, for example, was fundraisers for IDF soldiers to get helmets and that sort of thing. So this is a real case that we saw. That the reason that there are so many Zionists working together at these companies. There's a couple of them. One area that was really quite troubling is that they weaponized Jewish ERGs. So ERGs are employee resource groups. These are places where employees of similar ethnic or other sort of backgrounds work together to ensure that the company represents them very well. And those resource groups at many different big tech companies got weaponized by Zionists to shut down any content that was being critical of Israel or being critical of Israel's response after October 7th. You also have a lot of Israeli employees. So one of the very common things that we see is big tech companies buy Israeli companies. So there are Israeli employees at big tech companies who are, just on the corporate network, part of the standard conversations that are being had at these companies. So Google has 2,000 employees in Israel, Meta has 800 employees, and all of the policy for Israel-Palestine are, at Google and Meta are done in their Israel offices. So it's something where the bias is structurally built in. Similarly, like Nadeem mentioned, the trust and safety often has Zionist leadership. So at Meta, for example, the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, who's the head of sort of policy and trust and safety, is a Zionist, was in the Israeli army. Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg, these are people who have done very pro-Israel acts. Sheryl Sandberg, for example, who was their COO and built most of Meta, is currently on a sort of pro-Israel propaganda tour. So that's kind of like the big tech side of things. But the little tech side of things, the acquisitions into these companies, is a thing in itself. So little tech is the startups, and every big tech company started as a startup. With the exception maybe of TikTok, they all started as two guys in a garage in Palo Alto or something along those lines. And they took money from venture capital being the funding engine of startups. And so venture capitalists are incredibly powerful in the tech industry, and venture capitalists are incredibly Zionist as well. So on October 9th, some venture capitalists started putting together a statement of support for Israel, which had the statement, Israel has the right to defend itself. And it got signed by 865 firms very, very quickly in a matter of hours. 865 firms is maybe 20% of all the venture capital firms in the world. So it was a really substantial portion of it. And the way that it's done is really tight networks, right? There's Israeli venture capitalists, there's Israeli companies, there's a lot of tech companies in Israel, maybe 7,000. They are top of the world in terms of cybersecurity. And if you've heard of the Palestinian laboratory, that really extends into the startup space in Palestine as well. But you also have a lot of venture capitalists who are hard right. If you've heard of Peter Thiel, that there's an entire ecosystem around Peter Thiel. There's a lot of sort of US national security kind of thing. So people who are ideologically right-wing, ideologically aligned with Israel. We hear a lot of sort of these rabid anti-China policies coming out of these same folks, and that is having a lot of effect in the current political ecosystem in America because venture capital wound itself up with the Trump administration, and so there's a whole thing to unpack over there as well. But these venture capitalists also have a lot of influence because they're on these boards. Mark Andreessen, Peter Thiel, they were on Meta's board for more than 15 years each. So they are in incredibly powerful positions because they're in these companies from the very start. But they're also the people who decide what companies get funded, what companies get tens of millions of dollars to be the most successful companies. In a lot of ways, they are kingmakers. And as a result of this, founders, the sort of like the talent of Silicon Valley, they themselves find that they are afraid to speak out, because even though you probably only have about 20% of founders who are Zionist, you have about maybe 75% who are afraid of speaking out, because if they speak out, they might find that the venture capitalists will pull their funding. If they pull their funding, their company is dead, their dreams of wealth, the thing that they've been working on for 10 years, they might have to lay off all of their employees, or maybe certainly 50% of their employees if they're unable to get funding. So this sort of thing is really, really quite powerful. And venture capitalists have been funding Israeli startups um, uh, by an incredible amount, probably more than anywhere else outside Silicon Valley. As I mentioned, there are about 7,000 Israeli startups. They principally get funded by US venture capitalists, and US venture capitalists have, over the last year, maybe pulled out quite a lot in terms of the number of investments, but very, very big investments have continued to come in particular towards Wiz. Which was a significant portion of Israeli venture capital last year. So these startups, they get acquired by big tech. So now you have Israelis, now you have Zionists in key positions, in important positions. You have team members who are able to make these complaints to HR. So it works together to form a really powerful method of suppressing content internally. And so, even though we know that there are some leaders who are, for example, at Palantir, at Meta, these are sort of Zionists at the top. We don't really see Zionists at the top of Microsoft, of Google, for example. In the old days, we certainly did. Larry Page and Eric Schmidt certainly were. But these days, there's sort of questions of why is that happening, and a lot of it comes from the bottom, and frankly, it just comes from they want to make money, and there's a lot of money to be made in these these Project Nimbus and these things that where they're participating with the Israeli government and they're selling them cloud services. So it's a combination of zealotry in some parts of the company and just good old-fashioned greed in other parts.
Thank you very much, Paul, for speaking to that ecosystem, sort of both big and small, and how it's been reinforcing this type of internal suppression. And as we see with the concentration of tech power, particularly at Donald Trump's side, it's a very sort of terrifying hierarchy of power that we're going up against. But I'd like to turn to Zelda now to speak a bit about the efforts to disrupt and resist within those tech companies, because it is a bright spot of hope. And yeah, I'll turn it over to you, Zelda.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I am a labor organizer with No Tech for Apartheid and a former Google software engineer. No Tech for Apartheid is a worker-led campaign that is organizing Google and Amazon tech workers to drop Project Nimbus, which is the company's $1.2 billion cloud computing contract with the Israeli military and government. Notice started in 2021, and since then we've had thousands of workers voice their opposition to this contract through internally circulated petitions, a lot of social media stuff as well, internal flyering, political education. And over the course of Project Nimbus being around from 2021, we've seen that Google has been responding to the work that No Tech for Apartheid is doing, starting from like their origins and saying that actually Project Nimbus isn't a military contract, it's not a military contract in nature, and ultimately, being able to increase the pressure both from the press and from workers themselves who are organizing and saying we refuse to be associated with this contract to help build the technology that powers this contract. Is what's forced Google to at least address a lot of what their inconsistencies and lack of morality. Google's motto used to be "Don't be evil," and so a lot of us organize with that in mind and being this is us not being evil. And what you see instead is Google changing their mottos, dropping their mottos, changing their AI principles, for example, to say that they're not going to do weaponry to surveillance, and then being actually we don't really care. And like Paul is pointing to, there's a lot of money on the line, which is why they're able to just decide, okay, we actually don't care about these things anymore. So like I had mentioned, I'm a former Google software engineer, and that's because I was arrested and fired after a worker sit-in at the Google New York City office on April 16th of 2024. We were demanding that Google drop Project Nimbus, that they address the mental health and safety crisis of workers due to how their labor is being used, and that they end the culture of abuse, harassment, discrimination against Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim workers, as well as those who are advocating for them in the workplace. I was personally a target of coordinated harassment by Zionists in the New York City office because of my vocal nature in NOTA organizing there. Very crucially, NOTA is rooted in anti-militarism and anti-imperialism. NOTA recognizes that there cannot be an AI-assisted genocide without the tech labor that builds it. And as such, my work with NOTA as an organizer focuses on how we can build a mass movement of workers at Google through political education, through connecting with them about the issues that they care about, and mobilizing workers to resist building technology for apartheid and genocide. Ultimately, we as workers do have the power to decide what technology we build and how it is used. And as much as these tech CEOs might want to enter these contracts, if the workers refuse to build it, those contracts don't mean anything. And that's something that we try to get workers to recognize and to say, you know, there's a lot of powerlessness in this moment. What can I do? What can I do? But if you work at some of these places that have such direct ties to the genocide, there are material things that you can do. There are, for example, I always talk to people about the bombs that get dropped on Gaza are created, a lot of them here in the US. And so how can we mobilize workers who are in those factories, who are, you know, obviously in very difficult circumstances themselves because of, you know, there's just a lot of capitalism at work, making it very difficult for workers to be able to do what might be more aligned with their moral compass, but how can we make sure that we address some of those other needs that they'll have if they do engage in action? We are fighting back to make sure that technology that we build is for good and not for the destruction of communities in our planet. We need workers really to recognize, especially in the tech world, that their pay and benefits do come at the expense of their silence. We refer to that as the golden handcuffs. And you can try to look away at how this is affecting the entire world and how their technology is being deployed throughout the world to oppress and surveil and to kill. But at the end of the day, it is our responsibility and it will come back to affect us here. This is known as the imperial boomerang, the technology that oppressive governments or empire builds to oppress their colonial subjects will come back to affect us here. And I think about that all the time, being based in New York City, as I see the drones that New York Police Department uses to surveil protesters. And I think about the connections between the drones here, and the drones that are used to surveil Palestinians, especially since NYPD does train with Israel. They have actually an Israel office, which is ridiculous. Alongside my organizing work, I'm also a digital humanist that really wants to and is devoted to developing technology that's just built by, for, and alongside the public. Currently a master's student in digital humanities at the CUNY Graduate Center. And a lot of my research is focusing on education as well as creating digital memory archives as sites of tech labor resistance. We as people recognize that there are big issues and problems with the platforms that we use to try to organize, but we can't always articulate like what the issue is or have some sort of alternative. And my work tries to teach people technology in a way that like is embedded with their values. All of us care about things, and technology should not be separate from the things that we care about. We should actually be building technology embedded with our values, and that will serve as, you know, in direct opposition to capitalist tech. I think, Paul, you had a really good point about like big tech, small tech, and I kind of think about like, you know, this in a similar vein, like building tech for the world and building tech for your local communities, right? Like, I don't want to build something that is going to be for the entire world. I think that that kind of mindset is pretty colonial. It's a colonizing mindset and thinking I will be able to create something that all of you will benefit from, right? But I want to build something for New York City. I want to build something for the neighborhoods in New York City that I'm a part of. And maybe that means that it doesn't scale in the same way. But that means that we can still learn from each other. What is being built, for example, in New York City, for our specific needs here can still be, you know, brought to other major cities, other small towns. But it's going to be built differently. And so the people who build it in New York shouldn't want to go to rural America and say, actually, I have the solution for what you have over here. We have very different needs. I'm happy to talk about any of the labor organizing stuff, the importance of workers in rising against creating tech for genocide, and how we can create these structures of like education and community so that workers are also safe to take these risks and won't face immediate consequences to their livelihoods.
Thank you so much, Zelda. That was really incredible and inspiring to hear about. And for me, I want to underline in this talk that there is space for organizing in the technology world, that technology always does have this promise of good. And even though, we're up against, more resourced, wealthy companies that have more power, that technology does have this potential to bring us together, to organize, and to create a better world. And I think that's what we need to focus on, and not get lost in the despair. So I think, we'll definitely come back to those questions about organizing, and just something that I want to keep orienting us towards, so we don't just focus on feeling helpless. So, I mean, we've laid out, how these tech companies have control over content, over algorithms, to suppress, to censor voices, to structure these technologies with this kind of bias. But at the same time, social media has been critical for both Palestinian and non-Palestinian journalists and activists in reporting what is happening in Gaza. And I think even just this past week, or in the last 2 weeks or so, we're seeing a shift in some of the diplomacy from Europe, over these, continued images of starving children. It's played a role, I think, in pushing those governments now to put more pressure on Israel. So again, it's this tension of both the promise and peril of this kind of technology. So I wanted to just return to kind of the impact of this content in affecting public perception, and the discourse over the occupation and the genocide. And there's a couple of different ways to take this, but I also would be curious, Zelda, how that content played a role in some of the sort of resistance organizing that you were doing in the conversations with workers. Was that content sort of leading workers, hesitance and discomfort in what they were doing, or was that coming from more one-on-one direct conversations? So maybe we can start with you, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the panel.
Yeah, I've actually noticed that like we get a surprising amount of reach from our social media. But I think reaching the workers and then actually getting the workers to do things once they're reached are very, very different. And of course, like the more workers that we can reach, the more we're able to eventually like fold them into getting involved and taking agency. But I think that unfortunately, a huge product of capitalism is thinking that consumption is active, that like when you consume that you are doing something in your consumption, which it is not the case. It's sharing the right social media post isn't necessarily going to get us free. Like we need people to actually take action outside of there. So we definitely think of using anything that's on social media as just a way to reach workers, and then to kind of like be able to address more of um the actual work in one-on-one conversations. I'll also say that like yeah, I think that so on social media there seems to be at least in my circles like a lot more of like a polar like a you get one side of the polarization spectrum, so it's like everyone agrees with me here. And some of that other work is like Paul had been mentioning earlier, like how do we get people who like care but are scared and are scared of being called anti-Semites in the workplace and of being like targets of harassment in that way. That ultimately like social media can only do so much, that like one-on-one conversations and building community, building trust with people, having people able to come and say like like what does it even mean right now for me to be like accused of anti-Semitism? Like why is this like such a fear even in the face of like children being murdered every single day in Palestine?
Thank you so much. And yeah, I mean, that issue of polarization on social media, just that you're always talking to echo chambers, is a huge one. But at the same time, content has broken through. And, I think that we've seen that especially with the case of TikTok. And I think Tamara, you wanted to add something about that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, despite the shortcomings of social media platforms, including the censorship and the algorithms that make sure to perpetuate the polarization and echo chambers, I think social media platforms have played a very important role. And I would say TikTok, especially early on, because it didn't really have that tight control and censorship of pro-Palestinian content as Meta, which was involved with the Israeli government well before October 7th. And I mean, thanks to social media, not thanks to social media, but we're seeing a live stream genocide on our phones. And the only way it would have been possible is social media. And because of social media, nobody can say, I didn't know. And I would say in the context of this information blackout and ubiquitous censorship on all levels, like we've heard from everybody, social media platforms have emerged as alternative sources of information and action. And TikTok became the primary source of information about Gaza before the Israeli government, asked to meet with the senior executives of TikTok. But, there are several ways I think I can summarize the advantages of social media in this specific context. Maybe by four points. Social media is able to overcome the censorship and the traditional gatekeeping practices because gatekeeping on social media is harder and slower than traditional media. And it was able to amplify the Palestinian voices that are not heard otherwise. But also social media have provided a space to document abuse and created a digital archive of atrocities as evidence. And this evidence can be used and has been used in formal legal processes. Social media also provided spaces for transnational and intersectional solidarity for people to connect and mobilize together. And I would say the most important advantage is that social media users have assumed the role of the fourth estate in the absence of the media taking its role. They've acted as reporters and detectives, fact-checked, investigated, scrutinized, refuted Israelis' claims and government statements, and even named and shamed the media and the political leadership for their failure to tell the truth. We've seen online activists assign responsibility to Israel by fixing the news headlines, which tend to be passive, removing Israel as a perpetrator. And so here I think social media activists played an important role. You're probably familiar with the stories early on of the terrorist list that Israel was claiming was a list, which turned out to be a calendar. And no journalist did what social media users and content creators did in this case. So I mean, overall, despite the shortcomings, the biased media reporting and the lack of accountability for Israeli crimes have generated doubt about the credibility of both the media industry and the formal justice system. And this triggered this online movement of informal justice. And some academics refer to it as trial by internet, which ultimately impacted the media coverage and official discourse even slightly. And I think this is at least one positive thing we can take from technology.
Thank you very much. And then Nadim, I wanted to return to some of the work that you were talking about with Hamle in terms of challenging the content moderation bias that you were seeing after the Arab Spring, and to learn more about the successes and challenges of those campaigns, and then how that activism, how the space for that activism has changed since October 7th.
Yeah, so basically, I mean, I referred one of the struggles we had is around having a classifier in Hebrew and having content moderation in Hebrew, which was a successful one to a certain extent, that we managed finally to reach a situation where there is a Hebrew classifier, because previous to that, you could write any words like rape, kill, etc., any kind of genocidal text, and there is no machine with that would be detecting it. On the contrary to Arabic language, as I explained, that is heavily and over-moderated for almost a decade. So this was one of the things, that the good things. We are still like struggling with the company. We still want those classifiers to work and function in a better way. So we're still struggling on that aspect. We did not reach the place that the company should be taking, and preventing this like totally from happening. But there is like some steps that we managed to push the company to do, which were a good thing. So in the last few years, there were like several issues that there have been struggle around it. And when I say struggle, that there are different groups who are pressuring the company to do certain change of policy. Some of them are pro-Israeli, pro-Zionist groups, and some of them are defending the Palestinian digital rights as Hamle and allies. So one example is the whole issue of the weaponizing anti-Semitism. So at certain point, there were pressure from certain lobby inside the company and outside the company that the company need to adopt IRA definition of anti-Semitism, right? The new definitions of anti-Semitism, which means that if they were adopted, that would mean, it will really like prevent the Palestinian voices and allies and people who are criticizing any kind of criticism, towards the Israeli government from being on their platform. And on their products. And I remember that with the JVP and many other organizations, there was this huge struggle and pressure on the company. Many scholars also stepped in and wrote to the company and met with executives, and finally they decided not to adopt IRA. But lately, the issue raised again around the issue of if you are attacking Zionists as a proxy to Jewish people, and using certain descriptions, it means that yes, this is anti-Semitism, and then this would be removed, even if you are speaking against Zionists and not against Jewish people. And here we start again with the slippery slope and mixing with things. And unfortunately, we could not convince the company not to adopt this way, and really to put their efforts and channels in really fighting real anti-Semitism and not mixing between Judaism and Zionism. So that was another one. But there were also others, like, for example, there was a struggle around the DOI. So there was a blanket ban of the dangerous organizations and individuals. And as we know, many of the Palestinian groups, almost all of them, maybe except Fatah, are defined as a DOI. So basically, you cannot speak about them on the platforms. And part of the struggle was like, you have to have a nuanced policy, because if I'm a journalist and I'm writing about Hamas, I could be even criticizing Hamas, but for many years, this post would be deleted automatically and your account would be restricted, etc. So at certain point, this policy was, at least officially, was modified, saying that if you are writing something that praising or glorifying those groups, then the post should be taken down. But if you are in a news context or other context or academic or research, then this content should stay on the platform. And there was also during the war other two issues that were raised, and there were a huge fight and struggle around. One is from the river to the sea. So many groups pressure the company to delete this automatically and to have a blanket ban on this. Luckily, we did succeed to convince maybe not the company, and we're speaking here about the oversight board, obviously. So the oversight board is that body that the company created in order to take decisions around, or to take decisions sometimes, and also to recommend the company around those kind of issues. So normally the submissions that happen to the oversight board. Another issue that was and it's a huge issue, it's the issue of Shaheed policy. Shaheed is a martyr in Arabic. It was a blanket ban. I mean, for many years, for a decade or more, if you wrote the word Shaheed, means that your post would be removed. It came from Islamophobic approach, saying that if you write Shaheed, it means that you're glorifying violence and terrorism, etc., etc. Obviously, this is incorrect. Shaheed has lots of nuances. Shaheed word is used by 2 billion people coming from Islamic background, and everybody has different meaning to it. And finally, with the oversight board, the company did change and stopped, having a blanket ban to it. So just to summarize, I mean, yes, there are successes. It's a struggle. We are fighting against the company because the basic approach of the company is discriminatory and racist. And then about every small policy, you have to, to have coalitions or to have groups and people and scholars and others, and putting a heavy pressure. But we are managing in certain issues. We are managing to have certain successes here and there, but still, as a system, as a company, it's still very racist and biased company against Arabs and Palestinians.
Thank you for providing more detail on that. And I think that point about all these various policies that companies have internally brings up a good question from the audience Q&A that I wanted to pose to Paul. Somebody asked, can you ask Paul how all these companies are complying with their internal codes of conduct about equality, fairness, and justice whilst censoring the majority of their employees?
They're not. They are very much violating their own policies. A lot of the criticisms that have come from workers, such as No Tech for Apartheid, are that they're violating policies. They go about and they change policies in some cases where it doesn't suit them. OpenAI, for example, had a policy to not use its AI for military applications. It recently changed that policy, presumably to sell to the military. Why else would you change that policy? The other thing is that these companies, Meta in particular, but Google as well, have been famously open internally. For the vast majority of their lives, these companies were the sort of thing where an employee could take part in any conversation, that wasn't private or sales or that sort of thing, but policy kind of discussions could be had across the entire company. And what we've seen over the last couple of years, in particular since 2021, but even more so since October 23, is that the company just does not want these conversations to be had anymore. And I think that at Google, this is mostly to shut down No Tech for Apartheid, because the conversations that No Tech for Apartheid is creating are conversations that Google does not want to have. They don't have good answers for it, because the answers are, we stopped our don't be evil policy because now we want to be evil because it's more profitable. And it's a very difficult conversation. You can't be the CEO who sits on the stage and says that. So they have to find ways to work around it. And the ways to work around it are changes to community policies so that people can't ask those questions, so that rather than being the CEO or the CEO's team who's taking it down, it is the community team which goes around saying that is a divisive policy, and we do not have divisive conversations on our platform anymore. And that way they simply avoid, a lot of these companies signed up for the UN. I can't remember the name of it, but best practices for businesses in working in conflict zones, and they just ignore it. They don't, they sign up to it and then it doesn't matter. So the answer is they don't, and they don't want to.
I'm curious then, as a follow-up, how those policies then perhaps provide an avenue for organizing and resistance within companies, or potentially for legal action by groups outside.
So for legal action, I think it can be quite challenging. We've seen groups that look at how they can get involved in legal sort of actions. A lot of that focus has been on shareholder resolutions, where shareholders try to hold the company accountable to its own policies. It appears that those shareholder resolutions have been challenged quite a lot recently. In particular, the SEC and the folks who regulate these sort of things have removed a lot of the teeth of those policies. And the reason is that the companies do not actually want their shareholders to be making these kind of policies, largely because they're used by activists. But the reason that shareholders should be making these is because it is damaging to the company, right? We now know as Google, as the company, not the company that isn't evil and makes, fluffy little Gmail and that sort of thing. This is a company that's taking part in a genocide, where it was aware of the genocide, continued to take part in it, and actively shut down the people who are taking part of it, or who were complaining about it. That is a financial risk to the company. It is a reputational risk to the company. It is something where shareholders, this is the reason that you have shareholder accountability, and it's the reason that you have employee accountability, because employees are shareholders as well. Employees make quite a lot of money from these companies. Like tech workers, especially at Google and Meta, are very often very wealthy, and so they are the people who are who want their shares to stay valuable as well. And these companies are not just damaging their reputation to, on sort of a global scale, but they are, actively causing countries that, are not aligned with the US to have conversations about, should we be having Google products in our company? Should, what is the alternative to Meta? Should we be, Turkey, for example, shut down Meta for a short period? That is something that countries around the world are going to have to be taking seriously now, because all these big tech companies have lined up around a fascist US that is now having a very different policies to the ones that they had before. And that is going to be a real financial problem for these companies.
Thank you. Yeah. And that's, a reminder that public pressure, public perception is still such a critical aspect of this, and why it is, then such a battleground for these tech companies for social media and for that kind of control. There's so much to discuss here. I'm mindful of time, and before we move to other audience Q&A questions, I just wanted to continue with this kind of line of questioning about recommendations and organizing and strategies that we can continue to employ to try to push back on this. So Tamara, maybe we could start with you.
Sure. Just to follow up on what Paul was saying, I think, when reputational risk becomes financial risk, that's when, decisions can change. And that's where, the public plays an important role in putting pressure, organizing, and so on. And, just maybe one of the questions in the chat here was, about boycott strategies. And, that's one of the ways in which the public can organize. But in some cases where we have these monopolies or oligopolies, there's really no alternative. If consumers want to boycott all Meta's products, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, there are really not many alternatives left. And here, maybe when we talk about recommendations, one of the ways in which we can go about this is regulation. And one aspect of regulation is antitrust or laws and anti-competitive practices, which can help provide consumers with alternatives. But I also want to say, the two keywords here are transparency and accountability. And these companies must be required through regulations to disclose their dealings and involvements with repressive regimes and military entities. And they must also be held accountable for their role in abuses of human rights and international law. In addition to antitrust laws, there are regulations about, compliance with human rights and international law. I think Paul mentioned the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which is non-binding. And, again, the UN is fiscally, politically, and bureaucratically designed to rely on powerful states. And so generally, I think we can rule out the UN for now, given the institution's failure in upholding international law and human rights. But there's also other types of regulations that can be done at state levels, sanctions, boycotts, and so on. But regulations can involve the content moderation strategies to force the companies to be transparent with their content moderation strategies and policies and algorithms. But they can also involve issues that deal with not just the content, but the privacy and security of the data of the users. And here, I think there's also room for organizing. The EU has started with some of these regulations. I'm not sure to what extent. It's better than not having any of those, but for the most part, their penalties are fees. And even though these fees can be up to millions of dollars, these big tech companies and large multinational conglomerates really don't mind paying millions of dollars in fees, and it's just peanuts for them, and moving on with their business as usual. And so I think we really need a larger, comprehensive approach to regulation if we're talking about regulations. But at the same time, I think we must be wary because regulation is a double-edged sword. We've seen how laws have been weaponized to silence Palestinian content, and the IRA definition of anti-Semitism was mentioned already, but this is being adopted increasingly by many institutions. And if this becomes law, then it's easily weaponized to silence criticism of Israel and Palestinian voices and perspectives. And so at the end of the day, I think we do really need an international, multilateral, comprehensive effort that pressures both governments and tech companies to instate laws, policies that safeguard the human rights principles.
Thank you. Thankfully, here in the US, we have a functional Congress that I'm sure will take up that question, with deliberate speed. Nadeem, did you want to add on to what Tamara was saying?
Yes, I think like looking at the digital rights community and digital rights organization globally, I think many of us understand that with the current atmosphere in the US, the political atmosphere, as Paul described it, many of those companies are, adopting extreme right-wing politics and extreme right-wing approaches. And the usual way of engaging from the perspective of a digital rights / human rights organization with them is not helping anymore, because they are just simply saying, weaponizing AI. Before they were saying, as Paul mentioned, we will not use AI for military purposes. In a conference I was in, the head of the human rights department in Google was saying clearly, now it's a normal thing. It's a standard that we have contracts with ministries of defense around the world around the issue of AI. So they are not, trying to, put masks are down. They're saying it in a very clear way. And I think this forces us as a movement, as organizations, also to look for much more aggressive and much more clear tactics and strategies in front of those companies, including the legal aspect. So wherever there are legal avenues that we can, hold them accountable, that we, even if it's, just, one day in the court and shaming them through that process, even though we know that it's not a winnable case, I think we should still do that. I think on the issue of the European Union, it's still, and the Digital Service Act of the European Commission, I still think, I mean, obviously it's not perfect, and as Tamara mentioned, it could be also double-edged sword. But still, there are avenues through this act to hold the companies accountable in terms of forcing them to disclose information, and in terms of forcing them to deal with certain content, in terms of also having certain level of accountability that maybe does not exist in the US, because the European Union and some of the European countries have been adopting this approach of more proactive and more, let's say, legislation, regulation. So if we have a regulator in Holland or in the UK or in Ireland that we can approach and say, listen, there is this and that case, and we can, to some extent, hold them accountable. I think this is something good that's happening. Hamble and other allies, we are trying to explore this to understand those acts, including, by the way, also the AI Act that's happening, although it's very, European centric and it's not looking outside. But maybe it would be a kind of a way to check. But I think also the issue of shareholders that was mentioned before, I think this is something that should be considered. As much as possible, where it's possible, to try to put the issue of Palestine on those general assemblies. I know that different partner groups in the US are trying to push the Palestinian agenda. One of them around, for example, PayPal, that in the previous, I think 2 years ago, there was a resolution that was presented to the shareholders around opening up and why PayPal is discriminating Palestinians, not allowing them to use its platform. So it got only 11% of the votes. This did not pass, but still, Palestine issue was on the agenda. It was some pressure exercised against the leadership of the company. So I think this is something that we should continue and try to make it better. And the third issue is around the tech workers and trying to organize, as some of the colleagues already spoke about it. But I think this is something that should be investigated and try to have it in a larger scale, where there is some coordination that's happening in the movement, because there are many people who are involved in different aspects and levels, and I think the level of coordination should be better, in a way that when we are attacking one of the companies, there is like different voices from different angles directed to the same point.
Thank you so much. And yeah, that's a good segue back to Paul and Zelda to talk about organizing within the tech space. And as you answered, perhaps you can also take a couple of these questions from the chat that are sort of about how to encourage people to keep speaking out, when there are such repressive measures in place. And there was a question about whether it would be fruitful to draw parallels between companies and businesses that supported the Nazi regime. And also a question about how to address that issue of the golden handcuffs within the tech world. So, Paul, let's start with you.
Yeah, so the way that we think about the problem is that the Palestinian movement is often made up of sort of a few sort of like big organizations. And maybe that's the case in sort of a couple of countries, but it doesn't have the breadth of the Zionist movement. Almost anywhere you look, there's a Zionist, perhaps a family working with their local principal to bring the IRA definition at their local school. And that's the sort of like breadth that we don't have in the Palestinian movement. And I think, in terms of public pressure, that is an area that we're seeing a massive amount of interest. We hear from so many people who want to get involved in the Palestine movement and who don't know exactly how to get involved. And that sort of public pressure campaign, and in particular, I think we need to be taking a lot more of a holistic approach. And what I mean by that is more of a total boycott. So it's something where, let's say, for example, with McDonald's, all right, this is something where McDonald's is on the boycott list. I see people doing 50,000 person protests, but I don't see people doing 5-person protests outside of their local McDonald's, and doing it holistically, doing it from when McDonald's opens to when McDonald's closes 7 days a week. That is a protest that can have real impact. And as we start looking, or kind of real boycott impact, And this is something that the movement doesn't really do at this stage. So what part of what we do at Tech for Palestine is that we're starting, these movements. Currently, we support 60 organizations, or very, very young. It's almost not right to call it organizations, because sometimes it's one or two people, but that are building um, this sort of, in some cases it's a product. So Boycott, for example, is the official boycotting product of the BDS movement now, official partner. And that's something that you can actually use to scale up protests. You can scan your groceries in a way that really wasn't really possible before, where, but 5 years ago you just had to remember the names of companies. And so there's a sort of a step up where tech can really help with this sort of thing, and can really push the sort of like public pressure a lot further than was capable of being pushed before. I know you had other questions for me, and I'm blanking on them, so can you remind me?
Yes, let me return to them very quickly. There was one question about whether it's helpful to draw parallels between companies and businesses that supported the Nazi regime in its war generally, and drawing parallels to basically the involvement and participation of Microsoft, Meta, Google, Palantir.
I mean,
How useful of a rhetorical strategy is that?
I have used that before, and when we're talking about AI in particular, I think the comparison of lavender to let's say the gas chambers is a really good sort of metaphor there, because it's something that scales up a thing that they were doing anyway, and provides a sort of a little bit of a shield for it. But I don't think that it has real impact on companies. IBM is well known for having been involved in the Nazi genocide, and I mean IBM still exists today, Hugo Boss still exists today, Volkswagen. We know the names of the companies that were involved, and nothing really happened to them. So I don't think that it's I think it's nice rhetoric, and it's good for people to understand the comparison, but I don't think that it's going to help the companies move. And I think that as a society, people apart from people who are already well into the Palestine movement, don't really enjoy hearing about Israel being compared to Nazism, for kind of obvious reasons. So even though it's a very apt metaphor, I don't see it really being that effective.
Thank you. And then Zelda, what recommendations and strategies do you have for sort of the tech space for labor organizing?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, I think that um there's a lot of work to be done with having workers understand like what risk means. I say that because like I have lived my entire life in the United States of America and was born here. I'm a citizen here. Um, the kind of risk associated with like different kinds of tech workers taking action are going to be very different. I think that, golden handcuffs is some of the benefits and the pays are definitely part of the reason why workers are staying working at these places that they don't agree with. But I would say that like a lot of the contract workers, actually the majority of workers at Google, I believe, come from vendor and contracts rather than like being full-time employees, which means that they're subjected to like a lot different working conditions. They can be like it's a lot easier to get like fired. There's no benefits. You actually don't sometimes get access to the office in the same way which means that you don't get access to all those benefits that people talk about when working at Google. Um, but a lot of like I spent a lot of time thinking about um what I was going to be giving up when I was getting more and more involved with organizing with No Tech for Apartheid, or at least the risk of what I was going to be giving up. Um, because I grew up low income, myself, I was the child of immigrants. I'm the child of immigrants, and my parents were really concerned about like everything I was doing at work, and they're like, "You work so hard to get to Google," and I was like, "Well, I don't know. I was kind of brought down this path through multiple internships at Google, where like I have a lot of things to say about like predatory um student labor pipeline that like the big tech companies engage in. So like why was I 17 years old like signing my first like internship at Google, and like I can't be really making decisions like that, but then like I keep being like brought into the pipeline and then I end up working there full time. It's my first job out of college and now I'm getting paid like six-figure salary, stock. I have all this like all these benefits. I understand why it would be hard for people to like make that decision to be like I actually want to walk away from this. Um I think that like my political my political identity has followed me my entire life, so I think that that's always been front and center. And it's something that like requires a lot of patience with workers, where like workers could be coming from their own family lines that are have a lot more money, and so like they're not thinking about like class in the same way, they're not thinking about imperialism in the same way, they're not thinking about the matrix of oppression and how it dominates everything. But for people who are genuinely interested in doing more and they feel like it's like, I don't really know what I can do. There's like so much risk. I ask people to consider like, well, don't tell me the answers to these questions. Never reveal your citizenship status, please. But like, if you are a citizen, like your ability to take some sort of action in this country is a lot greater than the people who aren't citizens, and Google will recruit from people purposefully and like give them visas, and then they will bring their entire families here. So do you have kids that you also have to take care of, health care for all your family, right? Like there's a lot that like was put on the line, but then I also, I want to put aside like the idea of like what I sacrifice, and be like, well, people are getting bombed every single day, and like my job really doesn't matter in the wake of all of that. And like I ask people to like really consider like that above all, that feeling of being like, is it worth it that I get to have like all of these luxuries here in like the heart of empire, if it means that like it comes at the expense of people? And if my taking an action and connecting with people can make them think a little bit differently about like, oh wow, like maybe maybe it's not so crazy to think that I would give this stuff up, right? And like, what does it mean to give something up? Like, if all this stuff comes at the expense of lives, of human lives, of our planet, in many ways. I do think that like in answering the question that was um it put in the Q&A, that like it is affecting morale for people to be like, I kind of want to keep benefiting from this, but like I don't want to build this technology. Like I personally was struggling with going to work every single day, and the only thing though that kept me going was the fact that I knew that I was going there to talk to workers and to organize workers. And it doesn't always have to be centered on Palestine. I mean, everything eventually I'd be able to connect to Palestine, but you should be listening and talking to workers. This is like advice for like labor organizing, is like, be honest in the workplace. People are lying all the time about about how they feel about their boss, about how they feel about what the company is doing. And I would go into work and just be like, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. I'm going to complain about this. And little by little, the workers around me started talking to me about the things that they cared about, because they knew that I would like listen. And I think that was a very effective, and that is like effective labor organizing strategy, is to say like, what if we're just honest about our feelings instead of acting like we're all okay with coming here and doing the same thing and being programmed into like staying silent, and that there's a lot of fear around it. Um, but you find a lot of strength in being able to talk to other people, and you find that connection that makes you think maybe we can be doing something differently than this, because actually I'm not the only one who feels this way. There's lots of people around me who are feeling the same way. How come we all feel the same way, but like some person at the top is being able to decide like where the direction of this entire company goes? And that's really the ethos of labor organizing, is getting workers to understand that like when we are able to collectively organize ourselves, um they can't decide what we do, we get to decide. And ultimately like they don't really get to just tell us what to do. There's a lot of things to consider, and like, I think ultimately the fact that I can like wake up every day and not feel this dread about the place that I was getting money from is something that like engaging in any sort of like labor organizing struggle like does give you so much more than the things that you think you will be sacrificing, but it requires a lot of unwiring the things that you're taught to care about in this world.
Thank you. And Paul, I'm also curious from your experience in the tech world, what you would advise for this issue of the golden handcuffs.
So I think one of the things that needs to happen in order for this to be addressed is to get an off-ramp, not just for the people who actually get fired, who do need to have a safety net, who need to be able to still have a career, but also for the people who are still working in tech company, in the big tech companies, and want to get out. And so there's at Tech for Palestine, there was a project that was started that does exactly this. It's called Principled.careers. And it's careers for people who are principled. And so they helped place Ibtihal, who was fired from Microsoft recently. They helped place her in a new role. And they are there to help activists specifically who get fired or who want to step out from these big tech companies to get new roles. So if people are listening to this and they want to hire these kind of activists, these kind of brave people who are putting their jobs and their careers and their futures on the line, that's somewhere that you can do that.
Thank you. And I think both of your comments remind me that, again, there's a lot of work that can be done at the individual level. And really, I think we're at a stage where there need to be more one-on-one conversations and maybe talking with people who might not necessarily agree with you immediately, but they're persuadable, they're open, they're sort of disturbed by what's going on, but they need more guidance. And as Zelda said earlier, consumption of social media is not action. And I think in general, we're seeing this kind of moment where people are pushing back against the total digitization of our lives, just how online we are. And I think alongside that, we should take more opportunities to have some of these hard discussions, because there is, I think, a tide turning and people need more support and space to continue to see what Israel is doing, and not just be shamed for, I think, a feeling of paralysis or confusion, or just really a lack of knowledge and education. And so kind of just before we finish, I wanted to actually contrast that with some of the questions in the chat about accountability, whether for AI war crimes within international bodies, or some of these questions that we've had about different mechanisms and bodies that focus on sort of human rights policies, corporate due diligence, which hinges more again on public perception of companies. How much can companies be pressured into changing their complicity with the genocide based on public knowledge of what they're doing. So just sort of those two tracks. What kind of scope is there for accountability at this stage for what Israel is doing? I think in particular with AI, there was a question about that. And then, your recommendations about how fruitful, how successful it is to keep pushing companies about this human rights angle, how we can continue to push them to be mindful of that and to make changes based on that. I'm not sure who would like to take that first. Just feel free to
I can start by saying, I think we have to continue struggling on that issue. I mean, we don't really have other choice rather than the respecting and asking and demand for respecting of human rights and digital rights from those companies. I think also we should frame it not only as a Palestinian issue, because Palestine is a laboratory to test and to develop those technologies, and Israel has been, having this lucrative industry because it's basically being tested and developed on Palestinians, but later on being sold all over the globe. So it's not just an issue that Palestinians have to deal with. It's not just an issue that Palestinians are suffering from. And I think one of the best examples is to explain it also to other audiences, to other people, with Pegasus and NSO. It went through, the traditional line of people who have been in 8200, have been in surveillance units in the Israeli army, went and started with this startup, got license from the Israeli Ministry of Defense, got money from American venture funds and investors, and developed these technologies that have been like, sold all over from Arab regimes to African countries to Latin America, reaching Europe and the US. Ultimately, similar processes is happening with the other companies that are developing all of these AI-based technologies. So what we are seeing now, the mass killing, the mass destruction, the horrible technologies that are being used in Gaza as part of this genocide, maximizing the destruction of building and infrastructure, maximizing the killing of human beings in really short time. Because the soldier does not need, to do manually the targeting. There's the machine who's doing the targeting. I think those will be very soon deployed in other countries. I mean, there is a ruler now, there is an oppressor who's sitting and watching what's happening in Gaza and saying, yeah, this technology would help me in, I don't know, oppressing my people or in a conflict that I'm having with other country. So this should be framed in this way and explained in this way also to other people, to other movements around the globe, that this is a joint struggle to put a stop and to hold these companies accountable and to make sure that these technologies are not being sold all over. And even those companies, the big tech companies, because Israel could not do this alone, right? I mean, without the cloud services and the computing power that they are getting through the Nimbus and Microsoft Azure and other places, they could not do the same level of destruction and killing as they did. And that's why it's really important to look at it from a global perspective and to join forces with other powers, with other movements in order to have impactful struggle against those companies.
Maybe I could add to, I agree with Nadim. I mean, this is, in many ways bigger than just Palestine, but also we do have a Palestine exception to, in many cases, to international law and human rights. And in this case, on the issue of accountability, we have the tools of, business and human rights, international law principles, and so on. We can use these tools, and organizing public pressure has access to all these tools to use and pressure these companies and corporations. A lot of work has been done on arms embargoes, for example. And so similar work can be done on, big tech companies as well.
Thank you. Any final thoughts from you, Paul or Zelda? If not, I know that there's, there are so many questions that were sent in. I hope we were able to address most of them, sort of whether sort of thematically or directly. But yeah, again, I'll just reiterate that there are ways for everybody on this call to continue to get involved, and please visit the websites of Hamle, Tech for Palestine, No Tech for Apartheid. There are ways for everybody to get involved, and your presence here on this call means that you care, that you're committed to this, and that's the most important thing to remember going forward. So a huge thank you to all of our panelists for laying out such a complex array of issues with such detail and nuance. And hopefully this is just the beginning of this kind of conversation, and really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.